188 kilometres. That is how far beneath the seafloor the rock tore apart under Vanuatu's largest island on Sunday afternoon, at the end of 48 hours in which this planet produced 63 separate earthquakes in a single day. And that one number, not the magnitude, the depth, is why this earthquake killed nobody, and why it cannot tell you what everyone is asking it to tell you. Because underneath that island there is a drowned mountain range being force-fed into a trench, a hole in the sinking plate where earthquakes simply stop, and a 126-year record that answers the question in the title far better than the last 2 days ever could. So is something bigger coming? There is a real answer, and it has two halves that point in opposite directions. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. 188 kilometres down. At 3:20 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time on the 16th of August 2026, the ground underneath the largest island in Vanuatu moved. The United States Geological Survey put the magnitude at 6.1. It put the epicenter 56 kilometres north-northeast of a village called Port Olry on the northeastern coast of Espiritu Santo, and then it published a third number, the one that almost nobody reading the headlines actually stopped on, and the one this entire story turns on, 188.1 kilometres. That is the depth. That is how far below the seafloor the rock broke. In miles, it is roughly 116. To put that in something you can stand next to, it is the distance from Los Angeles to San Diego, except pointed straight down, through solid rock, into a part of the planet where the pressure is measured in gigapascals and the temperature climbs past 600 degrees Celsius. And here is the part I want to give you immediately, because you clicked on a video asking whether something bigger is coming, and you deserve an actual answer rather than 11 minutes of throat clearing before you get one. An earthquake at that depth is not the kind of earthquake that hurts people. The United States Geological Survey issued a green alert for this event. Green is the lowest of 4 levels, and it means a low likelihood of casualties and a low likelihood of significant economic damage. Roughly 145,000 people were exposed to weak shaking. Roughly 8,000 felt light shaking. There was no tsunami warning, because at 188 kilometres down, there is no physical mechanism by which this earthquake could have produced one. No significant damage has been reported. At the time this was written, exactly one person had filed a felt report with the United States Geological Survey. It is worth being precise about when this happened locally, because the headlines that carried it around the world were stamped in Coordinated Universal Time, and that makes it sound like a middle-of-the-night event. It was not. Vanuatu runs 11 hours ahead of Coordinated Universal Time. 3:20 in the morning Universal Time is 2:20 in the afternoon in Port Olry. This was a Sunday afternoon. People were awake, outdoors, working, and they felt the ground move under them in the middle of an ordinary day. And in Vanuatu, that is not an unusual thing to have happened. I want to give you a sense of the country, because most people watching this could not place it on a map, and it matters. Vanuatu is an archipelago of roughly 80 islands strung out over about 1,200 kilometres of the southwest Pacific, east of Australia and northeast of New Caledonia. The population is somewhere around 320,000 people. The capital, Port Vila, sits on the island of Afate in the south. Espiritu Santo, where this earthquake happened, is the largest island in the chain, and its main town, Luganville, is the country's second city. It is a place of coral coastline, mountainous interior, active volcanoes, and a national experience of ground motion so routine that it is woven into ordinary life the way weather is elsewhere. So on the narrow question of whether the earthquake that struck Vanuatu on the 16th of August is a warning shot, the honest answer is no, it is not. And I am going to spend the rest of this explaining why that answer is nowhere near as reassuring as it sounds. Because the place where this happened is genuinely one of the most seismically productive stretches of plate boundary on the surface of this planet. It converges faster than the San Andreas Fault by a factor of about 5. It has produced 87 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater since 1900. It is explicitly described in the scientific literature as capable of great earthquakes of magnitude 8 or above, with tsunami potential reaching every coastline in the Pacific Ocean. 20 months ago, it killed 14 people and did $231.7 million in damage to a country of roughly 320,000. and underneath the specific island where this earthquake happened, there is something in the geology that I think is one of the more remarkable things I've come across in a while, and that essentially nobody outside a handful of marine geologists ever talks about. There is a drowned mountain range being force-fed into the trench. We're going to get to that. But first, the timing, because the timing is why this earthquake is being talked about at all. A magnitude 6.1 is not, on its own, international news. The planet produces roughly 130 earthquakes in the magnitude 6 range every single year. That is one every 2.5 to 3 days, on average, somewhere in the world, forever. Most of them happen under ocean, or under mountains, or under places where nobody is standing and you never hear a word about them. This one arrived at the end of 48 hours that were, by any reasonable measure, unusually loud. On the 14th and 15th of August, eastern Indonesia was hit by a magnitude 7.7. 13 hours later and roughly 2,800 kilometers away, northern Sumatra was hit by a magnitude 6.9. In between and around those two events, the Western Pacific produced a steady procession of magnitude 4 and magnitude 5 earthquakes. When the Vanuatu event was catalogued, the United States Geological Survey feed showing all earthquakes above magnitude 2.5 in the previous 24 hours was displaying 63 separate events worldwide. 63 in a day. And when you see 63 dots on a map, and 3 of them are large, and they are strung out along the same broad curve of the Pacific Rim, the human brain does what human brains are extremely good at, and extremely unreliable about. It draws a line, it builds a sequence, it turns a scatter into a chain. I have been watching this happen in real time in comment sections and on social platforms for the last 2 days. People who have never in their lives had an opinion about subduction geometry are asking whether the earthquakes are connected, whether one is pushing the next, whether the pattern is migrating, whether there is something building, and they are not being stupid when they ask that. They are pattern matching on genuinely unusual input, which is exactly what you are supposed to do. The problem is that the pattern they are seeing and the pattern that is actually there are two different things, and telling them apart requires knowing one number about each earthquake, not the magnitude, the depth. Consider what those 48 hours actually contained. The Indonesian earthquake on the 14th of August ruptured at approximately 10 kilometers below the surface. As of the 16th, it had killed at least 47 people. It flattened at least 157 houses and damaged nearly 200 more. It destroyed more than 100 public facilities, including schools, medical centres and churches. It drove roughly 2,000 villagers out of their homes and into temporary shelter. It generated a tsunami, and it triggered landslides that blocked the roads into the region closest to the epicentre, so that more than a day later, rescue teams still had not physically reached the place that needed them most. The northern Sumatra earthquake on the 15th of August was magnitude 6.9, which is a genuinely large event, roughly 16 times more energetic than the Vanuatu earthquake we're discussing. It ruptured at 172 kilometers depth. It was felt across the city of Medan and out across the Strait of Malacca into Malaysia. It caused limited damage and no reported deaths. Then Vanuatu. Magnitude 6.1, 188 kilometers, green alert, no damage. 3 earthquakes. One of them has a body count, the other 2 do not, and the variable that separates them is not how much energy was released. The shallow one and the intermediate ones were within a factor of a few hundred of each other, which sounds enormous but matters far less than you would think. The variable that separates them is how far that energy had to travel through rock before it reached anyone. That is the thing I want you holding on to for the next 2 parts, because it is the key that unlocks everything else. Magnitude tells you how much energy the fault released. Depth tells you how much of it arrived where people live. And of the 2, depth is very frequently the one that decides who walks away. So what actually happened 188 kilometers beneath Espiritu Santo? What kind of rock breaks at that pressure, and why should it be breaking at all? What does an earthquake down there tell us about the interface far above it, the one that produces the tsunamis? The answer to that last question is going to surprise you, because it is almost nothing. And the reason it is almost nothing is the most interesting thing in this story. Part 2. The 48 hours that made everyone ask. Let me take you back 48 hours, because you cannot understand why people are asking this question without understanding what they just watched. At 5:58 in the morning, local time on Saturday the 15th of August, 2026, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake ruptured beneath the Flores Sea in eastern Indonesia. The epicenter sat roughly 68 kilometers north-northwest of the city of Ende, in the province of East Nusa Tenggara. It broke at approximately 10 kilometers depth, and unlike almost everything else we are going to discuss, it broke close to the surface, close to land, and close to people. The wave arrived first as a warning. Indonesia's meteorology agency placed 22 separate areas across 4 provinces under tsunami alert. The waves that came were, in the end, small, generally 0.2 of a metre to half a metre, with a maximum recorded height of 0.94 metres at Morol in the Ende region. Not a catastrophe. The alert was lifted. And in a story with as much loss in it as this one has, it is worth pausing on the fact that the ocean, this time, mostly stayed where it was. The ground did not. As of the 16th of August, the confirmed death toll from the Flores earthquake stands at least 47 people, revised upward from an initial 38. Officials expect it to climb further. At least 157 houses have been flattened. Close to 200 more are damaged. More than 100 public facilities have been destroyed. Schools, medical centres, churches. Around 2,000 villagers have abandoned their homes for temporary shelter. Read that list of destroyed public facilities again, because it describes something people rarely think about in the first hours of a disaster. Schools, medical centres and churches are not just buildings. In a rural district, they are the buildings, the ones with the largest spans, the flattest floors, the most open interior space, which means they are the shelters. They are where you put people when the houses fall down. Destroy 100 of them in the same minute you make 2,000 people homeless, and you have not just added to the damage total, you have removed the response, and the roads are gone. Landslides triggered by the shaking blocked access into Nagakeo, the region nearest the epicenter, and cut communications with it. More than a day after the earthquake, rescue teams had still not reached the place where the damage was likely worst, which means the number I just gave you, 47, is a number from the places that could be counted. It is not the final number, it is the number from outside the door of a room nobody has opened yet. More than 230 aftershocks hit the island through that first day, the strongest measured magnitude 6.2. Now hold that figure for a second, because there is a small technical point buried in it that will matter later. There is an empirical rule in seismology called Barth's law, which observes that the largest aftershock in a sequence usually lands about 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. For a magnitude 7.7, that predicts a largest aftershock somewhere around magnitude 6.5. What Flores actually produced was a 6.2, so the sequence was extremely prolific in count and slightly short at the top end. That is well inside normal statistical scatter. It is not a sign of anything. But it is the kind of detail that gets seized on when people are looking for signs, so I want it on the record now, explained, before anyone builds a theory on it. 12 hours and 56 minutes after Flores, and roughly 2,700 to 2,800 kilometers to the northwest, the second earthquake hit. This one was magnitude 6.9, according to the United States Geological Survey, near the city of Pematang Siantar in northern Sumatra, about 126 kilometers southeast of Medan. Indonesia's own agency, the BMKG, independently put it at magnitude 6.4, with their standard disclaimer that rapid solutions are not yet stable and may change as more data comes in. That is a spread of half a magnitude unit between two agencies, which sounds like a big disagreement and is in fact completely routine in the first hours after an event. That half-unit gap deserves 30 seconds, because it is the kind of thing that gets weaponized. Magnitude is logarithmic, and each full unit represents roughly 32 times more released energy. So the difference between a 6.9 and a 6.4 is not a rounding error. It is a factor of about 5.5 in energy. Two agencies publishing numbers that far apart looks, to an untrained eye, like somebody is lying. Nobody is lying. What is happening is that in the first minutes after an earthquake, every agency runs its own automated solution against its own network of stations, using its own preferred magnitude scale and its own crustal velocity model. Stations closer to the event weight the answer differently than stations on the far side of the world. The solutions converge over the following hours and days as analysts review the waveforms by hand. The disagreement is the sound of independent institutions working independently, which, as we will come back to much later, is the single strongest evidence against the idea that any of this is being coordinated or concealed. Here is the number that matters for northern Sumatra. Depth: 172 kilometers, according to the United States Geological Survey. 163, according to the BMKG. That earthquake occurred inside the subducted Indo-Australian slab, inside the sheet of oceanic plate that has already gone down into the mantle, far below the interface where one plate slides beneath another. It was a bleak slip. There was no tsunami warning issued, and again, none was physically possible. It was felt across Medan and out over the water into Malaysia. And the damage was limited, and the reason the damage was limited is written in that depth figure and nowhere else. There is one more thing about the Sumatra earthquake that got a great deal of attention, and it deserves a straight answer because on the surface it does look strange. It produced essentially no aftershock sequence. For a magnitude 6.9, that is unusual. A shallow 6.9 would normally be followed by a busy little cluster of 4s and 5s for days. Some people looked at that silence and got nervous. A few suggested it meant strain was still locked up, still waiting. I understand the instinct, but the explanation is not mysterious, and it is not sinister. Earthquakes at intermediate depth, that band from 70 to 300 kilometers, are known to be aftershock poor. The surrounding rock down there is hot. It is more ductile. It does not hold the small, sharp stress concentrations that produce a shallow aftershock swarm. It flows and accommodates them instead. The anomaly is real. The cause is depth. Again. So by Saturday night, the global picture looked like this. A killer earthquake in eastern Indonesia. A large but harmless one in northern Sumatra. 63 events above magnitude 2.5 in 24 hours. Aftershocks pouring in by the hundred. A tsunami alert raised and lifted. And in the background, a running tally of a year that had already produced 11 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater. And then, on Sunday morning coordinated universal time, the South Pacific went. If you were watching a map that day, and a lot of people were more than usual, you did not see 3 independent events on 3 unrelated structures. You saw a line, Indonesia, then Sumatra, then Vanuatu, west, northwest, then a jump southeast into the Pacific. It looked like something moving. The word people reached for, over and over, was migration. Pressure migrating north. Stress transferring along the arc. The dominoes going over one at a time. And underneath that word sits an assumption so intuitive that most people never examine it. That these earthquakes are talking to each other. They are not. And the reason they are not is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of arithmetic that you can do yourself in about 90 seconds, and I am going to walk you through it now. Part 3. 2,800 kilometers of nothing. Start with the thing that is actually true, because there is a real phenomenon at the bottom of the domino theory, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Earthquakes absolutely do trigger other earthquakes. This is not fringe science. It is the foundation of how aftershock forecasting works. When a fault slips, it permanently redistributes stress in the rock around it. Some patches get unloaded, other patches get loaded, pushed closer to failure. Calculate where those loaded patches are and you can forecast with real skill where the aftershocks will cluster. This is called Coulomb stress transfer, and it works. Vanuatu itself gives us a clean example. When the magnitude 7.3 struck near Port Vila in December 2024, it was followed by a magnitude 5.5 in essentially the same place. That is stress transfer. That is one earthquake causing another. It is real, it is measurable, and I am not here to tell you it does not happen. What I am here to tell you is how fast it dies with distance. Static stress change falls off approximately as the inverse cube of distance. Take a second with what that means because it is not intuitive. Double the distance and the effect drops to 1/8. Multiply the distance by 10 and the effect drops to 1,000th. Multiply it by 100 and you are down to 1/1,000,000th. Now apply that to what we actually have. Flores to northern Sumatra is roughly 2,800 kilometers. The rupture length of the Flores earthquake was on the order of 90 kilometers, so Sumatra sits something like 30 rupture lengths away. Run the arithmetic and the static stress change delivered from one to the other is a number so small it disappears beneath the stress the moon applies to the Earth's crust when it passes overhead. And tidal loading, which is far larger, is not a reliable earthquake trigger either. Vanuatu is roughly 5,000 kilometers from Flores. That is not a smaller version of the same effect. That is a different category of nothing. There is a useful rule of thumb buried in that arithmetic, and it is one you can carry to any future event. Static stress transfer is generally considered meaningful, out to a few times the length of the fault that ruptured. For a 90-kilometre rupture, that is a few hundred kilometres at the very outside. Beyond that, the numbers fall off a cliff. So when you see two earthquakes on a map and want to know whether one could have caused the other, ask a single question. How many rupture lengths apart are they? 2 or 3, and it is a live possibility worth taking seriously. 30, and you are not looking at a mechanism, you are looking at a coincidence with a good publicist. Now, the obvious objection, and it is a good one, what about the shaking itself? What about the waves? Seismic waves from a magnitude 7.7 really do circle the planet. They pass through everything. Could they not knock something loose on the way? The answer is yes, sometimes, and this is called dynamic triggering, and it is genuinely documented. Large earthquakes have been shown to set off small events thousands of kilometres away as their surface waves roll through. It is real. But look closely at where it happens and what it does, because the details close the door. Dynamic triggering is overwhelmingly a small magnitude phenomenon. It sets off tiny events, not great ones. It happens almost exclusively in shallow crust that is fluid-rich and already critically stressed. Geothermal fields, volcanic systems, places where high-pressure water is sitting in fractured rock waiting for an excuse. And it happens fast, generally during or immediately after the passage of the waves within seconds to hours. Now picture the rock at 188 kilometres beneath Espiritu Santo. It is inside a slab of oceanic lithosphere that has been descending for millions of years. It is cold relative to the mantle around it, but hot in absolute terms. It is under pressure measured in gigapascals. It is not a fluid-rich, shallow geothermal field. Of all the places on Earth where a passing surface wave might tip something over the edge, a slab interior at 188 kilometres is close to the least plausible candidate that exists. So the mechanism is not there. Not statically, not dynamically, not at that distance, not at that depth. Which leaves the question of why the sequence looked like a sequence. The honest answer is that this is what randomness looks like, and human beings are terrible at recognizing it. If you ask someone to write down a random sequence of coin flips, they will spread the heads and tails out too evenly, because their intuition tells them clustering means something. Real randomness clumps, rain clumps, bus arrivals clump, earthquakes clump, and the raw scale of the background activity makes clustering nearly guaranteed. On an average day, this planet produces on the order of 3,500 earthquakes of magnitude 2 or greater. Over a year, that works out to more than 1.3 million events in the magnitude 2 range alone. In the magnitude 6 range, the long-term average is about 130 a year. In the magnitude 7 range, about 15. 1 magnitude 8 or greater, roughly per year. Feed those rates into any random process and you will get weeks with nothing, and weeks with 3 large events stacked on top of each other. That is not a bug in the model. That is what the model predicts. A perfectly even spacing of large earthquakes, one every 24 days, tidy and regular, would be the genuinely anomalous outcome, the one that would send seismologists running for an explanation. And there is a second layer to it, which is that these faults are not independent in the way a coin flip is independent. They are just not connected in the way people think. The Australian plate is driving north into Southeast Asia at around 70 millimetres a year. That same plate is descending beneath the North Fiji microplate at Vanuatu at up to 170 millimetres a year. The same enormous engine is loading both systems. When 2 faults driven by the same plate motion both fail in the same week, they are not communicating. They are 2 clocks wound by the same hand, and they happen to strike at the same hour. There is one more version of this argument that I want to address directly, because it came up repeatedly in the last 2 days, and it is more sophisticated than the simple domino claim. The idea goes, fine, the individual events are not linked, but the region as a whole is being loaded, and when you see multiple large events around one area, you should watch the quiet zone between them, because that is where the next one goes. I want to give that its due, because as a way of framing hazard, it is not worthless. Seismic gaps are a real concept. If a subduction zone has ruptured along most of its length except for one segment, that segment is a reasonable place to focus attention. Geologists have used gap reasoning productively for decades. But there is a hard limit on what it can do, and the limit is this. Gap reasoning tells you where, and it never tells you when. A segment that has not broken in 300 years might break tomorrow, or might break in another 200. The gap does not fill on a schedule because there is no schedule, and crucially, a gap does not become more urgent because 2 earthquakes happened near it last week. The strain in that gap accumulated over centuries at a rate of millimeters per year. Nothing that happened in the last 48 hours changed it in any way you could measure. So the frame the audience is using is wrong. Not stupid, not unreasonable, wrong in a specific and correctable way. Which brings us back to the actual earthquake, and to a question that I think is far stranger and far more interesting than anything the domino theory has to offer. Because there is something genuinely bizarre about an earthquake at 188 kilometres. By everything we know about how rock behaves under pressure, it should not have been able to happen at all. Part 4. Why rock that far down should not break at all. Here is a fact that took seismologists most of the 20th century to make peace with. Earthquakes below about 70 kilometres should be impossible. The reason is friction. A shallow earthquake is, at bottom, a stick-slip event. 2 blocks of rock are pressed together and pushed sideways. Friction holds them. Stress builds. Eventually, the stress exceeds what friction can hold, and the blocks lurch past each other, releasing the stored elastic energy as seismic waves. That is the entire mechanism, and it is not complicated. But friction depends on the force pressing the 2 surfaces together, and that force increases with depth, because the weight of everything above you increases with depth. Push down hard enough and the 2 blocks simply will not slip past each other. The stress required exceeds the strength of the rock itself. Before that rock can snap, it deforms, it flows. Under enough pressure and heat, rock behaves less like glass and more like extremely stiff putty, and putty does not produce earthquakes, it just squashes. By the arithmetic of ordinary friction, everything below roughly 50 to 70 kilometres should be squashing, not snapping. Yet we record thousands of earthquakes a year in the 70 to 300 kilometre band, which seismologists call intermediate depth. We record them down to almost 700 kilometres. The one that shook Espiritu Santo on the 16th of August was at 188. This was not an easy thing for the field to accept. When seismologists in the 1920s and 30s began locating earthquakes with real precision, a Japanese researcher named Kyu Wadati noticed that if you plotted the depths of earthquakes beneath the Japanese islands, they did not scatter randomly. They arranged themselves along an inclined plane, shallow near the trench and progressively deeper inland, running down into the mantle at an angle. Hugo Benioff, working in California, found the same geometry elsewhere. The structure now carries both their names. At the time, nobody could say what the inclined plane was. It was decades before plate tectonics gave the answer, and the answer was that they had been looking at the shape of a slab of ocean floor sinking into the earth. The earthquakes were marking out its path like flour thrown at an invisible object. The reason those earthquakes existed at all, though, stayed unexplained for far longer than the geometry did. So something else is going on down there, and the leading explanations are both extraordinary. The first is called dehydration embrittlement. When an oceanic plate forms at a mid-ocean ridge, and then spends tens of millions of years sitting under seawater, it does not stay dry. Water works its way into the rock and gets chemically bound into the crystal structure of minerals, serpentine, amphibole, chlorite, and others. These are called hydrous minerals, and they are in effect waterlocked inside stone. When that plate eventually reaches a trench and starts descending, it carries all of that bound water down with it. Then it gets hot, and at specific combinations of pressure and temperature, those hydrous minerals become unstable and break down, releasing their water as a free fluid. That fluid has nowhere to go. It is trapped in rock under enormous pressure, and its own pressure spikes. High pore fluid pressure does something counterintuitive but well understood. It pushes the surrounding rock apart from the inside, reducing the effective force holding the fault surfaces together. It essentially cancels out part of the crushing weight. And with that weight partially cancelled, brittle failure becomes possible again in a place where it should not be. In other words, the slab is sweating, and the sweat is what lets it break. The second mechanism is called transformational faulting, and it applies mainly to greater depths, but it belongs in the picture. Minerals do not just melt as pressure rises, they reorganize. Olivine, the dominant mineral in the mantle, converts to a denser structure at high pressure. If that transformation happens quickly along a narrow band, the sudden change in volume can create a weak zone that fails abruptly, producing an earthquake without any water involved at all. What both mechanisms have in common is what makes them relevant to you, right now, watching this. Neither one is a sign of a fault failing. Both are signs of a slab being processed. An earthquake at 188 kilometres beneath Espiritu Santo is not the plate boundary giving way. It is the descending plate doing chemistry. It is a sheet of old ocean floor, bent and heated and squeezed, releasing water it absorbed before there were humans to notice, and cracking as it does so. It is a symptom of a subduction zone working exactly as designed, at exactly the rate it has been working for millions of years. Which brings us to the question that actually matters, and to the number that answers it. The structure that produces great earthquakes, the magnitude 8s and 9s, the ones that generate ocean-crossing tsunamis, is not the slab interior. It is the interface. It is the shallow contact surface where one plate slides beneath the other, generally in the upper few tens of kilometres. That is the megathrust. That is where the tsunami makers live. In Vanuatu, that interface sits in the upper reaches of the system, far above where this earthquake occurred. The reason the megathrust is the dangerous structure and the slab interior is not, comes down to three things, and they are worth naming because they explain every catastrophe in the modern seismic record. The first is area. A megathrust is a single continuous surface that can be hundreds of kilometres long and 100 wide, so it can slip over an enormous patch at once, and rupture area is what sets maximum magnitude. Nothing inside a slab has that much continuous surface available. The second is location. The megathrust reaches the seafloor at the trench, which means when it slips, it lifts the water column above it, and lifting the water column is how you make a tsunami. An earthquake at 188 kilometres displaces nothing at the surface at all. The third is proximity. Megathrust ruptures happen under coastlines, at shallow depth, right where people build. Get all three of those in one event and you get Sumatra in 2004, or Japan in 2011. The 16th of August had none of them. The separation between the rupture on the 16th of August and that interface is on the order of 130 kilometres of rock. And now go back to what we established about how stress falls away with distance, roughly as the inverse cube. 130 kilometres of separation from a magnitude 6.1, which releases roughly 1/180th of the energy of the Indonesian earthquake, and something like 1/5000th of the energy of a magnitude 8.5. Multiply a small number by a tiny fraction, and you get a number that does not register on any instrument we have ever built for measuring stress change in the crust. So let me put the answer as plainly as I can, because this is the payoff of the whole first act. The earthquake that struck Vanuatu on the 16th of August did not load the megathrust. It did not bring a great earthquake closer. It did not push, nudge, prime, or destabilize anything above it. It happened in a different part of the system entirely, separated by more than 100 kilometres of hot rock, and the physics that would connect the two does not exist at that scale. If you came here for reassurance about this specific earthquake, you have it, and it is real reassurance grounded in mechanism rather than in somebody telling you not to worry. But I want you to notice something about the shape of that answer. Everything I just said was about why this event tells us nothing. It is an argument from absence, and an argument from absence cannot tell you whether something bigger is coming. It can only tell you that this particular thing is not the reason to think so. To actually answer the question in the title, you have to stop looking at the earthquake and start looking at the place. And the place, it turns out, is extraordinary in ways that have almost nothing to do with what happened on Sunday morning, because Espiritu Santo is sitting on top of a collision. Part 5. The fastest boundary. Almost nobody watches. Ask most people to name a dangerous fault and you will get the San Andreas. Ask them to name a subduction zone, and if they know the term at all, you will get Cascadia, or Japan, or the one off Sumatra that produced the 2004 disaster. Nobody says Vanuatu. Nobody has heard of the New Hebrides Trench. That is a gap in public awareness, not in the science, and the science is emphatic. The Vanuatu subduction zone, still very often called by its older name, the New Hebrides Subduction Zone, after the colonial era name of the islands, runs for approximately 1,200 kilometres. That is 750 miles of continuous convergent plate boundary, arcing through the southwest Pacific. Along it, the Australian plate descends beneath the North Fiji microplate, in the broader zone where the Australian and Pacific plates are grinding against one another. The published characterizations of this boundary are about as direct as scientific writing ever gets. It is described as currently one of the most active subduction zones on Earth. It is described as capable of producing great earthquakes of magnitude 8.0 or greater, and the tsunami hazard from it is described as reaching all coastlines of the Pacific Ocean, not the neighbouring islands, not the Western Pacific, all of them. Think about what that third claim actually requires. For a tsunami to threaten every coastline in the Pacific, the source has to displace an enormous volume of water in a single event, and it has to do it in open ocean with nothing in the way. The Pacific is a bathtub with very few walls. A wave launched off the New Hebrides Trench has clear water, most of the way to South America in one direction, and clear water to Japan and Alaska in the other. That is why the hazard assessment reads the way it does. Not because Vanuatu is unusually violent for its size, but because of where it sits. There is one more line in that literature that I keep returning to, because it speaks directly to the earthquake we are discussing. Volcanic activity and intermediate depth seismicity behind the forearc at Vanuatu are among the highest anywhere on the planet. Intermediate depth seismicity. That is the exact category the 16th of August event belongs to. So an earthquake at 188 kilometres beneath Vanuatu is not just explicable, it is close to the house speciality. The volcanic half of that sentence is worth a moment too because you can see it from a boat. Vanuatu's islands are the surface expression of the same slab that broke on Sunday. As oceanic crust descends and sweats out its water, that water rises into the mantle wedge above it and lowers the melting point of the rock there. Melt forms, collects, rises, and builds volcanoes in a line parallel to the trench. That is why island arcs are arcs. Ambae, the island that early reports placed near the epicenter, is itself a volcano, a broad shield that forced a full evacuation of its population in 2017 and again in 2018 when it began erupting in earnest. Ambrym, just to the south, has spent much of the last century with lava lakes open at the surface. Lopevi is a near-perfect cone that has erupted repeatedly in living memory. Yasur on Tanna in the far south has been in more or less continuous mild eruption for centuries and is one of the few volcanoes on Earth that tourists routinely walk up to at night to watch. Those volcanoes and that earthquake are the same process, observed at two different depths. The slab releases water at 150 to 200 kilometres. Some of that release cracks the slab and we call it an earthquake. Some of it rises and melts the mantle, and we call it a volcano. Vanuatu has a great deal of both for exactly the same reason. So why does nobody watch it? Partly population, 320,000 people, is not a number that commands global media attention, and the archipelago is remote from the news capitals of the world. Partly instrumentation, the regional seismic network is thin compared to Japan or California, which is why so many Vanuatu events are located primarily by distant stations, and why felt report counts stay in the single digits for events 145,000 people experienced, and partly, honestly, because nothing here has yet produced a catastrophe on the scale that forces a place into permanent public memory. That last one is not a reassurance, it is a description of luck. Now let me give you the number that puts the rest of it in scale, because this is the one that reframed the whole story for me. Convergence rate. How fast the two plates are actually moving toward each other. In the northern part of the Vanuatu arc, it is approximately 170 millimeters per year. In the southern part, approximately 130. To have any feel for what that means, you need something to hold it against. The San Andreas fault system in California, the fault that dominates every conversation about American seismic risk, that has its own films, that runs beneath the driveways of tens of millions of people, accommodates roughly 34 millimeters of motion per year in total. Northern Vanuatu converges at about 5 times that rate. 5 times. Every year, the northern New Hebrides Trench swallows a length of ocean floor that would take the San Andreas half a decade to slide. 17 centimetres a year is fingernail growth. It is also, over a human lifetime, about 13.5 metres of plate. Enough, if it were all stored as elastic strain and released at once, to produce a rupture in the Great Earthquake class. There is a second consequence of that speed that gets less attention and matters more than the first. Fast convergence means the slab goes down fast, which means it stays cold longer. A slab descending at 170 millimeters a year reaches a given depth in less than half the time, A slab descending at 70 millimeters a year takes to get there, so it has had less time to be warmed by the mantle around it. A colder slab is a stronger slab, and a stronger slab is a slab that can still fracture at depths, where a slower, warmer one would simply flow. That is one reason intermediate depth seismicity at Vanuatu is described as among the highest anywhere. The speed of the boundary is written into the earthquakes it makes all the way down, and plates moving that fast do not store strain politely, they break constantly. A boundary converging at 17 centimeters a year has to release that motion somehow, and it does it the only way a brittle upper plate knows how, continuously, in earthquakes, at every scale, all the time. Which is exactly what the record shows. Since 1900, the Vanuatu region has produced 85 earthquakes in the magnitude 7 to 7.9 range, plus 2 of magnitude 8 or above. That is 87 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater in 126 years. Work it out and it comes to roughly 0.69 per year, which is one every 17 months, sustained for more than a century. Narrow it to the truly large events, and the picture holds. 34 earthquakes of magnitude 7.5 or greater have been recorded within this subduction zone since 1900, one every 3.5 years or so. Sit with that for a moment. A country of 320,000 people, on a boundary that delivers a magnitude 7 somewhere along it roughly every year and a half, and a magnitude 7.5 every 3.5 years, and that is explicitly rated as capable of a magnitude 8 or greater with tsunami reach across the entire Pacific Basin. That is the actual answer to the question in the title, and notice that it has nothing whatsoever to do with what happened in Indonesia last week. Something bigger is coming to Vanuatu. Something bigger is always coming to Vanuatu. It has been coming for the last 3 million years, and the reason it is coming has nothing to do with a magnitude 6.1 at 188 kilometers, and everything to do with a plate moving north at the speed of a growing fingernail and never ever stopping. But there is a wrinkle in that convergence figure, and it is the single strangest fact in this entire story. Because I gave you 170 in the north and 130 in the south, and those two numbers imply a smooth gradient from one end of the arc to the other. There is no smooth gradient. In the middle of the arc, the convergence rate collapses. Part 6. The number that breaks the pattern. 35 millimeters per year. That is the convergence rate at the central segment of the Vanuatu subduction zone. Not 170, not 130, 35. The published description of that transition uses the word abruptly, and abruptly is the correct word. This is not a gentle taper along a curve. You travel along one continuous plate boundary, one arc, one trench, and the rate at which the two plates are closing on each other drops by nearly a factor of 5 and then further along comes back up. I want to make sure the strangeness of that lands, because if you're not used to thinking about plate boundaries, it may not. Plate motion is, at the larger scale, extremely well behaved. Plates are rigid. They rotate about poles on the surface of a sphere. The velocity at any point on a plate boundary is set by that rotation, and it changes smoothly and predictably as you move along the boundary, faster far from the pole of rotation, slower near it, in a way you can calculate from first principles. Sudden factor of 5 discontinuities in the middle of a single arc are not something the simple model produces. The formal version of this is that plate motion on a sphere is described by rotation about an Euler pole, a single axis through the centre of the Earth, with the two plates turning relative to each other about it. Once you know where that pole sits and how fast the rotation is, the velocity at every point along the boundary follows automatically from geometry. Points far from the pole move fast, points near it move slowly, and critically that variation is smooth, because a sphere is smooth and a rotation is smooth. Nothing in that description permits a rate to drop by a factor of 5 over a short stretch of one arc and then recover. It is worth appreciating how well the simple model normally works, because that is what makes the exception meaningful. Plate velocities calculated from Euler pole geometry, worked out originally from the magnetic stripes recorded on the seafloor and the orientations of transform faults. Match velocities measured directly by satellite positioning to within a few percent across the entire planet, over timescales from a decade to a few million years. That agreement is one of the quiet triumphs of 20th century Earth science. Plates really are rigid enough, and really do rotate cleanly enough, that a handful of numbers describe the motion of the whole surface of the Earth. which means that when a boundary refuses to obey, the refusal is information. So when you find one, it means something local is interfering. Something is physically getting in the way. And this is not a Vanuatu-only curiosity. It happens wherever a thickened piece of seafloor arrives at a trench, and the examples are some of the most studied stretches of subduction zone on the planet. The Nazca Ridge is being subducted beneath Peru, and where it goes under, the slab flattens out and the volcanic arc above it shuts off entirely. The Cocos Ridge is being driven into Costa Rica, and the result is a mountain range and a warped forearc. The Louisville Seamount chain is being fed into the Tonga-Kermadec Trench, and it visibly disrupts the geometry of the boundary where it enters. In every case, an unsubductable piece of crust arrives, and the tidy model breaks. At Vanuatu, the interference has a name, and the name is the D'Entrecasteaux zone. Before we get to what it is, notice what the numbers alone are telling us. The plates are not moving more slowly in the middle because the engine has weakened. The Australian plate is one object, and it does not know that the middle of the New Hebrides arc exists. It is being driven north at the same rate along the whole boundary. If the plates are converging more slowly in the middle, and the driving force has not changed, then the motion that is not being accommodated at the trench has to be going somewhere else. It has to be showing up as deformation, as crumpling, as thrusting, as uplift, as something being physically squeezed and lifted and broken in the rock around the collision point. Put a number on it, and the scale becomes hard to ignore. If the plates in the north are closing at 170 millimeters a year, and the central segment is only taking up 35, then something on the order of 135 millimeters a year of relative motion has to be accommodated some other way. Over 10,000 years, that is more than a kilometre of shortening that never went down the trench. Over 1,000,000 years, it is over 100 kilometres. 100 kilometres of crustal shortening has to show up somewhere. It shows up as thrust faults in the overriding plate. It shows up as folded and stacked rock. It shows up as islands standing higher out of the water than they have any business standing, and that is precisely what the geology of Espiritu Santo records. The island is not sitting quietly above a subducting plate. It is sitting on top of a slow-motion crash, and it has been lifted by that crash, and the mountain that broke on the 16th of August is part of the wreckage. Now, a fair objection at this point, does a slower convergence rate mean less hazard? 35 millimeters a year is still faster than the San Andreas, but it is a lot slower than 170. Does the collision act as a brake? The answer is that it changes the character of the hazard rather than reducing it, and this is a distinction that comes up again and again in seismology. We ran into a version of it a few days ago looking at a fault in the East Bay of California, where the surface of the fault creeps steadily, and people take that as evidence the pressure is being relieved, when the published work says the opposite, that the creep is part of why that fault breaks as often as it does. Slow is not the same as safe. It is a different failure mode, not the absence of one. A subducting slab that goes down cleanly, at high speed, with nothing jamming it, tends to produce a relatively organized system, a well-defined interface, regular large events, a recognizable pattern. A boundary where something is being rammed into the trench and refusing to subduct produces a mess. The stress does not travel down a tidy interface. It radiates outward into the overriding plate, fractures the forearc, uplifts islands, and creates a compressive regime that reaches across the whole width of the arc. That last phrase is not mine. Reviews of the geological evidence and shallow seismicity of the central New Hebrides conclude that the radiant horizontal stresses resulting from this collision have generated a specific compressive stress regime influencing the entire width of the arc, the entire width, not the trench, not a fault, the whole thing, from the trench through the forearc and the islands and out the back. There is a practical consequence of that for anyone thinking about risk in this part of the world, and it is uncomfortable. In a clean subduction zone, you know roughly where the dangerous structure is. It is the interface, it dips at a known angle, and hazard modelling can be built around it. In a collision zone, the hazard is smeared. Thrust faults inside the overriding plate can produce damaging earthquakes directly beneath islands, at shallow depth, on structures that may not even appear on a published fault map. The megathrust is still there and still capable, but it is no longer the only thing to worry about. So the 35 is not a reprieve. It is a symptom. It is what the number looks like when a plate boundary is being jammed rather than being slid. And it means the earthquake risk in the central New Hebrides is spread across more structures, in more places, than a simple picture of a subduction zone would suggest. which raises the obvious question, and it is the question this whole middle section has been building toward. What, exactly, is being jammed into it? Part 7. The Drowned Mountain Range. In the Trench. Somewhere west of Espiritu Santo, under 2 or 3 kilometres of seawater, there is a ridge. It is not a small feature. It is a submarine mountain range, a linear rise of thickened crust running across the floor of the Coral Sea, the seafloor remains of a much older tectonic episode. It is called the d'Entrecasteaux Zone, after the French naval officer Bruni d'Entrecasteaux, who sailed these waters in the 1790s searching for the lost expedition of La Pérouse and left his name scattered across the southwest Pacific in the process. Its northern component is called, straightforwardly, the North d'Entrecasteaux Ridge, and it is being fed, slowly and relentlessly, into the New Hebrides Trench. This is the part I find genuinely remarkable, so let me set the physics up properly. Ordinary subduction works because oceanic crust is dense. It forms hot at a mid-ocean ridge, cools over tens of millions of years as it moves away, gets denser as it cools, and eventually becomes denser than the mantle underneath it. At that point it wants to sink. It is not being pushed into the trench so much as it is falling into it, dragging the rest of the plate along behind it. Subduction is, to a first approximation, gravity winning. But that only works if the crust arriving at the trench is normal oceanic crust, thin, 5 to 7 kilometres, cold and dense. A ridge is not that. A ridge is thickened crust. It might be double or triple the normal thickness, built up by an ancient volcanic episode or a piece of a rifted continental fragment, or an old spreading centre that never quite finished. Thick crust is light crust. It is buoyant, and buoyant things do not sink. So the ridge arrives at the trench and it does not want to go down, and what happens next is one of the most consequential processes in plate tectonics, because it is how continents grow and how mountain ranges are born. The Himalaya exist because India was too buoyant to subduct beneath Asia and had to go up instead. What is happening off Espiritu Santo is the same physics, running at a smaller scale, in the middle of an ocean, in real time. At Vanuatu we can watch it happening now. The documented consequences read like a description of a collision in progress. Collision and subduction of the North d'Entrecasteaux Ridge results in the off-scraping of ridge material and the plating of the forearc with thrust sheets, and the technical term used in the literature for those thrust sheets is flakes, together with distinct forearc uplift. Read that again slowly, because there is a lot in it. Off-scraping means the ridge is not going down whole. The upper part of it is being sheared off as it enters the trench, like the top of a stack of paper being pushed against a wall. Plating of the forearc with thrust sheets means those scraped-off pieces are being stacked onto the front edge of the overriding plate, one on top of another, thickening it. The forearc is being built out of the wreckage of the ridge, and forearc uplift means all of that stacking is pushing the overriding plate upward. Islands rise. This is not inference from a model. It has been drilled. The ocean drilling program on Leg 134 put boreholes into this collision zone, and multi-channel seismic reflection surveys have imaged the structures developing inside the collisional accretionary wedge, the pile of scraped-off material, west of Espiritu Santo Island. The wedge is there. It has been sampled. We know what it is made of. I find the drilling detail quietly extraordinary, so let me spell out what it involved. A research vessel positions itself over 3 kilometres of open ocean, holds station against wind and current, lowers a drill string through all of that water, and then cuts into the seafloor and brings back cylinders of rock from a collision zone nobody can see. Those cores are what turn a plausible story about a ridge jamming into an arc into a documented one. The structural interpretation, the stacked thrust sheets, the plating, the geometry of the wedge, comes from seismic reflection profiles, which are essentially ultrasound scans of the crust. Fire a sound pulse down, record what bounces back off each layer, and build a cross-section from the returns. Put the scan and the cores together, and you have a picture of a mountain range being disassembled and pasted onto the front of an island arc. The timeline has been reconstructed too, and it is more precise than you might expect for something happening under 3 kilometres of water. The d'Entrecasteaux zone is not stationary relative to the arc. It is migrating northward along the boundary at approximately 2 to 4 centimetres a year, based on quaternary relative convergence rates. The collision zone is a moving contact point, sweeping slowly along the arc like a blade along a whetstone. Working backward from that migration rate, The initial collision of the D'Entrecasteaux zone with the arc has been dated to approximately 3 million years ago at the latitude of Epi Island. And the moment the North D'Entrecasteaux Ridge specifically made contact with Espiritu Santo has been placed in the early Pleistocene, between 1.89 and 1.58 million years ago. Take a second on the precision of that. Not sometime in the Pleistocene, not a couple of million years ago, a window 310,000 years wide, for the moment two pieces of the Earth's crust made contact under 3 kilometers of seawater, reconstructed from migration rates and convergence geometry by people who were never there and never could be. That range, 1.89 to 1.58 million years, is when the mountain range hit the island. Homo erectus was walking around East Africa. Our own species would not exist for another 1.5 million years, and a drowned ridge in the Coral Sea began pushing into the front of the New Hebrides arc, and it has not stopped pushing since, and everything about Espiritu Santo, its elevation, its raised coastal terraces, the fact that it is the largest island in the country at all, is downstream of that contact. The evidence for that is written along the island's own coastline, in a form you can walk on. Where a coast is being pushed up faster than the sea can wear it down, the shoreline does not stay at sea level. Old wave-cut platforms and old coral reef flats get lifted clear of the water and stranded, and then a new one forms below, and then that one gets lifted too. The result is a staircase, a flight of raised terraces climbing the hillside, each step an abandoned shoreline, each one recording a stretch of time when that particular level was where the waves broke. Work along the coast of Espiritu Santo has documented exactly this kind of uplift signature, and it is the surface fingerprint of the ridge collision underneath. There is a coda to this that I think about more than is probably reasonable. The collision point is migrating north at 2 to 4 centimeters a year, which means it has not always been under Espiritu Santo, and it will not always be. It swept up the arc from the latitude of Epi over the last 3 million years, and it will keep going. Whatever is happening to Espiritu Santo now happened to the islands to the south already, and will happen to the islands to the north in time. The islands are taking turns being crashed into, so when I said earlier that Espiritu Santo is sitting on top of a collision, I meant it in the most literal possible sense. The island exists because of it, and now put the earthquake back into that picture. On the 16th of August 2026, a magnitude 6.1 broke inside the descending plate, 188 kilometers beneath an island that was lifted out of the sea by a ridge collision that started before there were people. The slab that broke is the same slab that carries the ridge. The stress regime it is breaking under is the one that collision created, radiating across the entire width of the arc. That is a far better story than another one hit, and it gets stranger because of what happens to the earthquakes themselves at exactly the depth range where this one occurred. Part 8. The hole in the slab. If you take every intermediate depth earthquake ever recorded in the central New Hebrides Islands and plot them by depth, you do not get an even smear from 70 kilometers down to 300. You get a hole. There is a documented gap in intermediate depth seismicity in the central Vanuatu arc, sitting between 100 and 200 kilometers depth, with a lateral extent of approximately 150 kilometers. Within that window, the slab is quiet in a way the rest of it is not. The published description of it uses the word remarkable, which in the language of a scientific paper is close to shouting, and the position of that gap is not random. It sits close to the extrapolated location of the subducted portion of the D'Entrecasteaux fracture zone. In other words, take the ridge that is colliding with the arc at the surface, project it downward along the path the slab follows as it descends, and the place where the ridge should be at 1 to 200 kilometers depth is the place where the earthquakes stop. The interpretation is not fully settled, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but the natural reading is that a slab carrying a thickened, buoyant, structurally different piece of crust does not behave the same way at depth as a slab carrying ordinary ocean floor. Different composition means different hydrous mineral content, which means a different amount of water available to be released, which means dehydration embrittlement does not fire in the same way at the same pressures. A slab segment that is drier or hotter or mechanically weaker simply does not produce the same population of earthquakes. Follow that reasoning all the way through, and it produces a claim that is, if it holds, remarkable. It would mean the quiet zone at 1 to 200 kilometers below the central New Hebrides is a shadow, the buried, delayed, downward projection of a collision happening at the surface today. The ridge that is being scraped and stacked and shoved against Espiritu Santo right now has an older portion of itself already down there, 150 kilometres under the island, and you can find it not by seeing it, but by noticing where the earthquake stopped. That is a strange and rather beautiful way to locate something. It is the seismological equivalent of finding an object in a dark room by the shape of the silence around it. And it is not the only place we do this. The interior of the Earth is mapped almost entirely by inference of this kind. We have never sampled the mantle directly. The deepest hole ever drilled reached about 12 kilometres, which is less than 1/5 of 1% of the way to the centre. Everything we know about what lies beneath comes from watching how waves behave as they pass through it, where they speed up, where they slow, where they bend, where they fail to arrive at all. The core was discovered because certain waves were missing from certain places on the surface. A shadow, correctly interpreted, is one of the most powerful instruments in the field. There are alternative readings, and honesty requires naming them. The gap might reflect a tear in the slab rather than a change in its composition. It might reflect a genuine hole where the slab has detached and foundered. It might partly be a cataloguing artifact because locating earthquakes precisely at that depth in a region with a thin instrument network is hard, and a gap in a catalogue is not always a gap in reality. Any of those could be true, and the published record does not close the question. Now. The earthquake that struck on the 16th of August 2026 occurred at 188.1 kilometres. That is inside the window. I want to be extremely careful here, and I want you to notice me being careful, because this is precisely the sort of fact that gets grabbed and inflated into something it is not. That earthquake did not fill the gap. A single magnitude 6.1 does not fill a seismicity gap 150 kilometres wide. The gap is a statistical description of a century of catalogued events, not a hole in the rock with a shape you can close. And more importantly, a gap in intermediate depth seismicity is not a gap in the megathrust. These are different structures at different depths doing different jobs. Seismic gap reasoning, when it is used responsibly, is applied to the shallow interface, the segment of megathrust that has not ruptured while its neighbours have. Nobody uses intermediate depth seismicity gaps to forecast great earthquakes, because there is no established relationship between the two. I labour this point because I have watched the same move made 100 times with 100 different observations. Somebody finds a real, published, technically accurate fact, a seismicity gap, a tremor count, a swarm, a deformation signal, and then quietly swaps the meaning of the fact for the meaning of a different fact that happens to sound similar. The gap becomes a gap. The count becomes a countdown. Nothing in the underlying science has changed, only the sentence around it has. And the reason that move works so well is that the original fact really is true, so anyone checking finds the source and comes away reassured that the claim checked out. So what does it actually mean that an earthquake occurred inside that window? It means the slab beneath Espiritu Santo has a documented, unusual internal structure that most subducting slabs do not have, and something just broke inside it. It is a genuinely interesting observation about the plumbing of this specific subduction zone. It is a reason for a seismologist studying slab dehydration to look up from their desk. It is not a reason for anyone in Luganville to change their plans. There is a piece of information that would sharpen all of this considerably, and at the time of recording it does not exist yet. When a large earthquake is analysed properly, seismologists derive what is called a moment tensor, a mathematical description of the geometry of the slip, which tells you whether the rock was pulled apart, pushed together, or sheared sideways, and along what orientation. Inside a descending slab, those two possibilities carry very different meanings. Down-dip extension means the slab is being stretched by the weight of the part of it that is already lower down, pulled apart by its own sinking. Down-dip compression means the slab is running into resistance below and is being squeezed against it. If the mechanism for the 16th of August turns out to be extensional, it says the slab beneath Espiritu Santo is falling freely and tearing under its own weight. If it turns out to be compressional, it says something further down is pushing back. That single distinction would tell us more about what is going on beneath that island than the magnitude number ever will, and it is a genuinely worthwhile thing to watch for in the coming days as the reviewed solution is published. But it does give us one thing that is worth a great deal, and that is a comparison, because this is not the first earthquake to break inside that slab beneath that island this year, not even close. Part 9, 5 months, 1 island, 2 earthquakes. On the 30th of March, 2026, at 44 minutes past 8 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time. 7:45 in the evening local time, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck Vanuatu. The epicenter was placed near Espiritu Santo, roughly 35 kilometers northeast of Luganville, the island's main town and the country's second city. The depth was approximately 116 kilometers, 72 miles. Nearly 140,000 people may have experienced strong to very strong shaking, including everyone in Luganville. Port Vila, the capital, 300 kilometers to the south, may have felt light shaking, and no tsunami warnings or advisories were issued because none were warranted. That March earthquake was, incidentally, one of the 11 events of magnitude 7 or greater that the planet produced in the first 226 days of 2026. It was an oblique thrust at roughly 120 kilometers, and there is a figure attached to it in the catalogue analysis that tells you something important about this specific patch of the world. 19 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater had occurred within 150 kilometers of it in the preceding century. 19, within 150 kilometers, in 100 years. That is not a place where large earthquakes are unusual. That is a place where large earthquakes are the local weather. Now hold those two events side by side, because this is the comparison the entire video has been building toward, and it is the single most useful thing I can give you. The 30th of March, magnitude 7.3, 116 kilometers down, beneath Espiritu Santo. The 16th of August, magnitude 6.1, 188 kilometers down, beneath Espiritu Santo. 4.5 months apart. Same island, same descending slab, both inside it rather than on the boundary above it. Neither one produced a tsunami, neither one killed anybody. And the March event was, in energy terms, roughly 63 times larger than the August one. 63. If a magnitude 7.3 at 116 kilometers beneath Espiritu Santo did not trigger a great earthquake in the 4.5 months that followed, and it did not, then the idea that a magnitude 6.1 at 188 kilometers is going to do it now is not a hypothesis. It is a hope that the arithmetic will look away. That is the first thing the comparison gives us. A control experiment, run on the same island, at the same kind of depth, with 63 times the energy, 5 months ago. The result was nothing. Not nothing meaning quiet. Luganville shook hard, and 140,000 people felt it. Nothing meaning no cascade, no escalation, no great earthquake on the interface above. The second thing it gives us is more interesting, and it is a genuine open question rather than a debunk. 2 intraslab earthquakes beneath one island in under 5 months, at 116 and 188 kilometers, is a pattern. Not a large one, and not necessarily a meaningful one. A boundary that produces a magnitude 7 every 17 months on average will inevitably produce clusters like this by chance, and the honest default is that this is exactly that. But it is a pattern that sits in exactly the depth range where the D'Entrecasteaux structure should be, and it is a pattern in a slab that has a documented hole in it at those depths. The slab beneath Espiritu Santo is doing something. It is deforming internally at 2 different levels over a short span of months. Whether that reflects the passage of a structurally unusual piece of crust down the subduction zone, or ordinary internal slab stress in an extremely fast converging arc, is a question I cannot answer from a magnitude and a depth, and neither can anyone else without the mechanisms and a lot more data. What I can tell you is what it would take to turn that from an interesting observation into a concerning one, and this is the part I want you to actually retain, because it is portable. You can use it on the next event and the one after that. Watch for shallow seismicity, not more depth. A cluster of magnitude 4 and 5 events in the upper 30 or 40 kilometers along the trench west of Espiritu Santo would be a genuinely different signal. That is where the megathrust lives. Events there load the structure that matters. Events at 188 kilometers do not. Watch for aftershocks where there should not be any. We established earlier that intermediate depth earthquakes are aftershock poor because the rock down there is too warm and too ductile to hold sharp stress concentrations. So the expectation after the 16th of August is very little. If instead a productive shallow sequence lights up under Espiritu Santo in the days after a deeper main shock, that would be a real anomaly, because it would mean energy from a place that should not be able to reach the shallow crust has somehow reached it anyway. Watch for repeating events on the same patch. Where foreshock sequences exist at all, They tend to cluster tightly in space and escalate in magnitude. A 3, then a 4, then a larger 4 in nearly the same spot over hours to days. Nothing remotely like that is present here. The March and August events are separated by 70 kilometres of depth and 4.5 months of time. And watch the deformation, not the earthquake count. Global navigation satellite system stations across the Vanuatu arc measure how the ground is actually moving, continuously, in millimetres. They record strain accumulating between earthquakes. A change in that signal is a direct observation of the loading process itself. A number on a website counting how many dots appeared on a map in the last 24 hours is not. I want to underline the difference between those last two things, because it is the difference between watching the machine and watching the noise the machine makes. An earthquake count tells you what has already broken. A deformation measurement tells you what is being loaded. One is a record of releases, the other is a record of the pressure, and if you want to know whether something bigger is coming, the pressure is the thing you want to be looking at. Almost everything the public sees is the first kind of information: earthquake maps, event feeds, 24-hour counts, coloured dots sized by magnitude. All of it is a record of things that have already happened. It is the wreckage, catalogued in real time. There is nothing wrong with it, and I look at it every day. But it is fundamentally a rear-view mirror, and using a rear-view mirror to work out what is ahead of you is a specific kind of mistake that a very large number of people are making right now. The forward-looking information exists. It is measured. It is public. It is just less dramatic, because a graph of a satellite station drifting 3 centimetres northeast over 4 years does not look like anything, and a red dot appearing on a map at 3 in the morning does. And one more honest caveat on all of this, because I would rather give it to you than have you find it on your own. Even the good information is not a prediction. Deformation data tells you where strain is accumulating and roughly how fast. It does not tell you when the rock will fail, because failure depends on the strength of the fault at the moment of failure, and nobody can measure that. What good data buys you is not a date. It is a properly ranked list of places and a properly calibrated sense of how loaded each one is. That is worth an enormous amount. It is just not the thing people want, which is a warning with a time on it. So, the 16th of August event, judged against the March event, against the physics, against the depth, and against every watch criterion that actually has diagnostic value, is not a warning. Which leaves the harder half of the question completely untouched. Because Vanuatu really does get hit. Not hypothetically, not in a model. It has happened, repeatedly, within living memory, and the most recent time was 20 months ago. And every single time it happened, one number looked different from the numbers we've been discussing. Part 10. The earthquakes that actually hurt Vanuatu. On the 17th of December 2024, at 47 minutes past 12 in the afternoon local time, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck about 24 to 31 kilometres west of Port Vila. Depth, 57 kilometres. 14 people were killed, 265 were injured. Many more were reported missing in the hours that followed. Large buildings collapsed in the capital. Electricity went down and water was cut across most of the city. Landslides came off the slopes and were a major contributor to the damage total, which came to $231.7 million United States dollars. Approximately 80,000 people were affected. In a country of roughly 320,000, that is one person in 4. A magnitude 5.5 aftershock followed near the same location, which incidentally is a textbook example of the stress transfer we discussed earlier working exactly as it should. One earthquake loading the rock immediately beside it and setting off another. At a few kilometres, that mechanism is real and measurable. At 2,800 it is not. Same physics, opposite conclusion, and the only thing that changed was the distance. The recovery from that December earthquake was documented in detail, because the scale of it demanded a formal assessment. The United Nations Development Programme carried out a household and building damage survey. Residential buildings took the worst of it. The capital's water supply and electrical grid both failed. And in a country where the capital concentrates the hospitals, the port, the airport and the government, damage to Port Vila is not local damage. It is national damage. That is the shape of a shallow earthquake in Vanuatu, not an abstraction, 20 months ago, in a city, in the middle of a working day. Now compare that earthquake to the one we have been discussing for the last hour and change. December 2024, magnitude 7.3, 57 kilometres depth, 24 kilometres from a capital city. 16th of August 2026. Magnitude 6.1, 188 kilometres depth, 56 kilometres from a village of a few hundred people. Both in the same country, both in the same subduction system. 14 dead in one, nobody hurt in the other. It would be easy to put all of that difference down to magnitude, and magnitude is part of it. A 7.3 releases something like 63 times the energy of a 6.1. But magnitude is not the biggest part. The biggest part is that the December 2024 earthquake ruptured at 57 kilometres, close enough to the surface that the energy arrived at Port Vila as violent, high-frequency shaking of the kind that snaps concrete columns. The August 2026 earthquake released its energy 188 kilometres down, and let 130 extra kilometres of rock absorb the sharp end of it before it reached anybody. And once you have that lens, the whole historical record of Vanuatu resolves into a single pattern. Go back to the 26th of November, 1999. A magnitude 7.5 struck near Pentecost Island. Depth, 15 kilometres. 15. Barely below the surface at all. It generated a tsunami, and the tsunami was particularly destructive along the southern part of Pentecost. 5 people were killed on an island with a population of roughly 12,000. In absolute terms, that is a small number, and it is small because Pentecost is sparsely settled, not because the event was gentle. Put that same rupture under a city and the number does not stay at 5, and notice what 15 kilometres buys you that 188 does not. To make a tsunami, you have to move water, and to move water you have to move the seafloor. A rupture at 15 kilometres reaches close enough to the surface that the whole column of rock above it lifts or drops, and the ocean sitting on top has to go somewhere. A rupture at 188 kilometres is buried under so much rock that the deformation smears out into nothing long before it reaches the seabed. The surface barely notices. That is the entire reason no tsunami warning was issued on Sunday, and it is not a judgment call by a duty officer. It is geometry. There is a second thing shallow depth buys, and it is what actually breaks buildings. Rock filters seismic energy as it travels, and it filters the high frequencies out first. Short, sharp, rapid shaking, the kind that snaps a concrete column or shears a wall from its foundation, attenuates fast. Long, slow, rolling motion travels much further. So an earthquake close to the surface delivers its energy to nearby buildings still full of the sharp frequencies that damage them, while a distant or very deep one arrives as a long, sickening roll, extremely alarming to experience, far less destructive to ordinary low-rise structures. Witnesses to intermediate depth earthquakes almost always describe the same thing, a slow, rolling, prolonged motion. That description is a depth reading in disguise. Go to the 2nd of January 2002, a magnitude 7.2 near Afate and Port Vila, major damage to buildings and infrastructure in the capital. The Tioma Bridge, connecting the southern coast of Afate to Port Vila, was destroyed outright. 3 more bridges linking Port Vila to North Afate were seriously damaged. No serious casualties were reported, which was frankly fortunate. I want to pause on the bridges because that detail matters more than it looks. In an archipelago, in a country with a limited road network, bridges are not a convenience. They are the only way in. Destroy the bridge, and you have not just damaged infrastructure, you have isolated everyone on the far side of it, from ambulances, from supplies, from assessment teams. We watched precisely that dynamic play out this week in Indonesia, where landslides cut the roads into Nagakeo and more than a day later nobody had reached the region closest to the epicenter. The earthquake does the first round of damage, the severed axis does the second round slowly over the following days, and go back further to the 2nd of December 1950, magnitude 7.8. That remains the strongest instrumentally recorded earthquake in the Vanuatu Islands region. The phrase instrumentally recorded is doing quiet work in that sentence and deserves unpacking. It means the strongest since we had machines capable of measuring it. Global seismographic coverage good enough to size a distant earthquake reliably only really arrives in the early 20th century. Before that, the record of what happened in a remote Pacific archipelago consists of oral history, missionary accounts, ship's logs, and geological traces in the ground. Vanuatu's catalogue therefore covers roughly 126 years of a system that operates on timescales of centuries to millennia. So when the assessment says this boundary is capable of a magnitude 8 or greater, that is not primarily a statement about what has been observed. It is a statement about what the geometry, the convergence rate, and the fault dimensions permit. The observed record is a short sample from a long process, and the largest event in a short sample is almost never the largest event the system can produce. Now line the whole list up and look at the depths. 1999, Pentecost, 15 kilometres, 5 dead destructive tsunami. 2002, Port Vila, shallow, bridges destroyed, capital damaged. 2024, Port Vila, 57 kilometres, 14 dead, 265 injured, $231.7 million, 1 in 4 citizens affected. 2026, 30th of March, Espiritu Santo, 116 kilometres, strong shaking, no deaths, no tsunami. 2026, 16th of August, Espiritu Santo, 188 kilometres, weak shaking, green alert, no damage. Every single event in Vanuatu's record that killed people or destroyed infrastructure was shallow, every single one, and both events that shook Espiritu Santo this year were far too far down to do it. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a comforting accident. It is a rule, and it holds worldwide. The Indonesian earthquake this week killed at least 47 people from 10 kilometres depth. The northern Sumatra earthquake, larger in magnitude than the one that killed those 47 people in Vanuatu terms, and only slightly smaller in energy, killed nobody from 172 kilometres. In Colombia last week, an earthquake of magnitude 7.4 ruptured at over 100 kilometres depth and produced, for its size, a strangely dispersed pattern of damage. Buildings failing in cities hundreds of kilometres from the epicentre, while the ground directly above stayed comparatively intact. Depth decides. Over and over, depth decides. So when the question is whether something bigger is coming to Vanuatu, I want to be very precise about what bigger means, because bigger in magnitude is not the thing that should worry anybody. Bigger in the sense that matters is shallower, and the record says that when Vanuatu gets a shallow one, the consequences are immediate and severe, and the country has demonstrably not run out of them. Part 11, 87 earthquakes and a 17-month clock. Let me now put the whole ledger in front of you, because this is where the honest answer to the title actually lives. Since 1900, the Vanuatu region has recorded 2 earthquakes of magnitude 8.0 or greater, and 85 earthquakes in the magnitude 7.0 to 7.9 range. 87 events of magnitude 7 or above in 126 years, divided out 0.69 per year, 1 every 17 months. Narrow the window to the truly serious end and the picture holds up. 34 earthquakes of magnitude 7.5 or greater have been recorded inside this subduction zone since 1900. That is 1 every 3.5 years or so. Sit with those figures, because they are the reason the answer to the question in the title is not simply no. A magnitude 7, somewhere along this arc, every 1.5 years. A magnitude 7.5 every 3.5 years. For 126 years running, in a country of 320,000 people, on a boundary explicitly assessed as capable of a magnitude 8 or greater, with tsunami reach across the entire Pacific. Something bigger is coming. Of course something bigger is coming. It has been coming continuously since before anyone was counting. But, and this is the distinction I need you to hold on to because absolutely everything turns on it, the fact that something bigger is coming is not evidence about when. This is where an idea has taken hold that sounds rigorous and is not, and I want to take it apart carefully, because it has been circulating heavily in the last few days. The idea goes like this. Earthquake magnitude is logarithmic. Each unit represents roughly 32 times more energy. So a magnitude 9 releases about 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 7. It would take 1,000 magnitude 7s to add up to 1 magnitude 9. Now look at some stretch of subduction zone, count the 7s it has produced, and observe that they come nowhere close to 1,000. Conclude that the energy is still in there, unreleased, accumulating, and therefore that a great earthquake is due. The arithmetic in that argument is correct. I want to say that clearly, because the people making it are not making a numerical mistake. 32 times per unit is right. 1,000 to 1 ratio across 2 units is right, and the underlying intuition that moderate earthquakes do not meaningfully relieve the strain stored for a great one is also right, and it is a genuinely important point that a lot of people get backwards. A swarm of 4s does not let the pressure off. It really does not. The problem is the word due. A fault is not a savings account with a scheduled withdrawal. It does not owe anyone anything. Elapsed time since the last great earthquake is one input into a hazard model, and it is a legitimate input. It is why paleoseismology exists and why trenching studies matter. But it is not a countdown, and the variance in these systems is enormous. A fault with a 200-year average recurrence interval will routinely deliver gaps of 90 years and gaps of 400 years, and both of those are the same fault behaving normally. An average is not a schedule. It is the middle of a very wide distribution. The best documented illustration of this anywhere on Earth sits in central California, on a segment of the San Andreas that ruptures with almost clock-like regularity. The events came in 1857, 1881, 1901, 1922, 1934 and 1966. An average interval of about 22 years, tight enough that seismologists built an entire prediction experiment around it, instrumented the segment heavily, and waited for the next one on schedule. It arrived in 2004, 38 years late on a 22-year clock on what is probably the most regularly behaved patch of fault ever studied. If the best behaved example we have can overshoot its own average by more than 70%, no subduction segment on the planet is running to a timetable you can plan around, and the energy accounting has a hole in it that is rarely mentioned. Strain does not only leave a fault system through earthquakes. Aseismic slip, steady creep, and slow slip events release accumulated strain quietly, over days to months, without producing any earthquake at all. In some systems, those processes account for a substantial fraction of total motion. None of it appears in a catalogue of earthquakes because none of it is an earthquake. So when someone counts the sevens and concludes that the missing energy must still be stored, they are assuming that the only exit from the reservoir is the one they can see. Here is the version of the idea that survives scrutiny. A subduction zone with high convergence and a long quiet stretch on a particular segment is a place that deserves attention, and specifically it is a place where you would want good instrumentation and serious preparedness planning. That is legitimate, and hazard agencies do exactly this. And here is the version that does not survive, treating the absence of a great earthquake as positive evidence that one is imminent. That is the gambler standing at the roulette table counting how many times it has come up black. So what does the 17-month figure actually license us to say? It licenses this. Over any given 10-year window, the Vanuatu arc will very probably produce somewhere around 7 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater, and 2 or 3 of magnitude 7.5 or greater. Some of them will be at depth and will do nothing but rattle windows. Some of them will be shallow, and when a shallow one lands near Port Vila or Luganville, the 2024 event tells us what that costs. 14 lives, 265 injuries, a quarter of the national population affected, and $231.7 million in a country that does not have $231.7 million to spare. That is a real, quantified, entirely non-speculative hazard, and it does not need last week's earthquakes to justify it. It stands on 126 years of catalogue. There is one more statistic that belongs here, because it is the closest thing to an honest answer anyone can give when asked whether a given earthquake was a warning. Roughly 5 to 6% of large earthquakes turn out afterwards to have been foreshocks, the opening event of a sequence that produced something larger. That is the base rate. It is not 0, which is why nobody serious ever says a large earthquake definitely was not a foreshock. But it is small, and far more importantly, that identification is only ever made retrospectively. There is no measurement, no signature, no pattern in the waveform that distinguishes a foreshock from an ordinary earthquake at the time it happens. A foreshock is not a type of earthquake. It is a label applied later by whatever comes next. So the honest answer to was that a foreshock is always the same. Ask again in a month. And the honest answer to does the fact that it might be a foreshock mean I should worry is that the same 5 to 6% applies to every large earthquake anywhere, including the several hundred that have happened since you started watching this channel, and treating each one as a possible prelude is a way of being permanently alarmed at a constant background rate. And that is the frustrating shape of this answer, so let me say it plainly. The thing people are worried about, the sequence, the migration, the chain, is not real. And the thing that should worry them, which is a fast subduction zone with a documented history of killing people from shallow depth, was already true last week, and will still be true next month, and has nothing to do with what happened in Indonesia. Which raises a question that has been sitting underneath this entire video, and that I want to face directly now. If the loud earthquakes are the harmless ones, and the dangerous structures are the ones making no noise at all, then what were the quiet parts of the map doing during those 48 hours? The answer, it turns out, is the most unsettling part of the whole story. Part 12. The Faults That Said Nothing. While 63 earthquakes were lighting up the 24-hour map, and while Indonesia was counting its dead, and while Espiritu Santo was shaking from 188 kilometres down, the most dangerous fault systems in the developed world produced almost nothing at all. Start with California, because it makes the point fastest. During that entire window, the state of California did not record a single earthquake above magnitude 2.5. Not one. The San Andreas Fault produced a scatter of small events on its central creeping section near pinnacles, all of them well under the threshold. The Hayward Fault, running directly beneath the East Bay and something like 2.5 million people, produced a magnitude 1.7 near Orinda. There was a magnitude 2.6 near Jackson, Wyoming, well outside the Yellowstone and Grand Teton systems. That is it. That is what the most instrumented, most studied, most publicly feared fault network on the continent was doing on the loudest seismic weekend of the year, and it is not reassuring. It is the opposite. The Hayward Fault sits about 158 years into a recurrence interval estimated at 161 years, plus or minus 65. The southern San Andreas has not produced a great earthquake since long before instruments existed. Neither of those facts changed at all during the last 48 hours, and neither of them will show up on any 24-hour earthquake map, ever, until the day it matters. We looked at the Hayward in detail a few days ago, and the numbers attached to it are worth recalling here for scale. The United States Geological Survey has modelled a magnitude 7.0 on that fault in some depth. The modelled outcome runs to roughly 800 deaths, some 18,000 injuries, more than 400 fires started by ruptured gas lines, over $82 billion in direct losses, and water service disruption to parts of the East Bay lasting from 6 weeks to 6 months. $82 billion from a fault that contributed a magnitude 1.7 to this weekend's global earthquake map. That is the entire problem with reading 24-hour maps as risk assessments, expressed as a single comparison. This is the thesis of the entire video, inverted and handed back to you. The earthquakes you can see are the ones that already released their energy. The danger lives in the places that are silent, because silence on a locked fault is not the absence of a process, it is the process. Now go north, to Cascadia. Off the coast of Oregon and Washington runs a subduction zone with a documented history of magnitude 9 events. It has been quiet in the earthquake sense for a very long time, but it is not motionless, and we can watch it move. Buried at the lower edge of the plate interface below the locked zone, there is a band where the two plates slide past each other slowly rather than sticking and snapping. When they do, they generate a faint, sustained vibration. Not a jolt, but a low hum lasting hours to weeks, far too weak for anyone to feel and detectable, only because we have instruments listening for it. It is called tectonic tremor, and counting the individual epicenters of it gives you a real-time measure of slow slip happening at depth. During this window, the Cascadia tremor count in a rolling 24-hour window reached 333 epicenters, concentrated at the southern end of the zone beneath Northern California and the southern Oregon coast. That was up substantially from an earlier reading of 71, which had been weighted toward the Portland area. A small earthquake occurred just west of Eugene, inside the same region the tremor had migrated to. Now, what does a rising tremor count mean? Here is where a lot of people go wrong, and they go wrong in a way that is understandable. A number is going up. The number is associated with a subduction zone that everybody has been told will one day produce a magnitude 9. It is very natural to read the rising number as a countdown. It is not. Tremor is a measurement of the plate continuing to descend in the part of the interface that has never been capable of a great earthquake because it slides rather than sticks. Slow slip episodes at Cascadia recur on a roughly regular cycle. They have been happening for as long as we have had instruments sensitive enough to record them, and they will keep happening. Published work has been explicit that no known link has been established between these episodes and megathrust hazard in Cascadia. The honest framing is subtler and more interesting than a countdown. Slow slip at the lower edge of the interface does transfer a small amount of stress up onto the locked zone above it. That is real. but it is a small increment on top of an enormous accumulated load. It happens on a schedule that has repeated many times without consequence, and treating each episode as an alarm means treating a routine part of the system as an emergency several times a year, forever. The same interpretive trap is set at Nankai. During this window, a magnitude 4.1 registered on segment A of the Nankai Trough, off southern Japan. The Nankai system is divided into 5 segments, labelled A through E, and it is capable of a magnitude 9. Historically, its segments rupture in pairs, or occasionally altogether, and the last major series was in the mid-1940s. A magnitude 4.1 on a system like that is, in energy terms, effectively nothing. Nankai will produce a magnitude 4 somewhere along its length constantly. The reason it draws attention is that everyone knows what Nankai is capable of, and so any event there gets read against the worst case rather than against the background rate. That asymmetry is worth naming, because it distorts almost every conversation about seismic risk. A magnitude 4 in Kansas would be a curiosity. The same magnitude 4 off Shikoku becomes evidence because the observer already has a catastrophe in mind and the event gets recruited into it. The earthquake did not change, the frame around it did, and once a system has acquired a reputation, Nankai, Cascadia, the San Andreas, Yellowstone, every routine twitch it produces gets read as a prelude, which means those systems generate an essentially permanent stream of false alarms that has nothing to do with what they are actually doing. And in the Marianas, the same pattern again, 2 earthquakes recorded, one near Guam and one on the Izu Trench to the north, with the stretch of Mariana Trench between them quiet, which immediately invites the reasoning we examined earlier. Watch the gap because the middle is where it will fill in. I gave that idea its due already, and I will not repeat the argument. But I want to name the common thread running through all 4 of these because it is the thing worth carrying away. Cascadia's tremor count, Nankai's magnitude 4, the Mariana quiet zone, and California's silence are 4 different observations, and the public reads all 4 of them the same way, as signals about timing. Something is happening, therefore something is about to happen. None of them are timing signals. The tremor count is a measure of ongoing slow slip. The magnitude 4 is background noise on a system that will make thousands of them. The Mariana Gap tells you where, in the loosest possible sense, and never when. And California's silence is not information about California at all. It is the sound of nothing being released. Which brings us back to Vanuatu one more time, because the 16th of August event belongs in exactly this collection. A real earthquake, a correct magnitude, a correct depth. Read, almost universally, as a message about what happens next, when it is nothing of the kind. And that habit of reading messages into the data has a more extreme form, because in the last 2 days, a lot of people have not just been drawing lines between earthquakes on the same side of the planet, they have been drawing them straight through it. Part 13. The Theory That Cannot Be Wrong. I have been asked about this repeatedly over the last few days by more than a few people, and when people ask me something honestly, I am not going to pretend the question was not asked. So let us do the antipodal earthquake theory properly. The claim is this: if a large earthquake strikes at one point on the globe, the next large earthquake will strike, or is disproportionately likely to strike, at that point's antipode, the spot diametrically opposite on the far side of the planet, at the other end of a line drawn straight through the centre of the Earth. Before I take it apart, I want to steelman it, because there is real physics at the bottom of this, and it is not fair to pretend otherwise. Seismic waves from a great earthquake really do converge at the antipode. That is not folklore. The Earth is a sphere, and waves spreading outward from a point on a sphere spread until they reach the equator of that point, and then begin converging again, focusing back down onto the opposite pole. The effect is measurable. Seismologists use antipodal arrivals to study the deep interior, because waves that have crossed the whole Earth carry information about everything they pass through, and in impact literature, antipodal focusing of seismic energy has been seriously proposed as a mechanism for producing disruption on the far side of a planet from a giant impact, including in some work on Chicxulub. So the mechanism is not made up. Energy really does converge there. The question is whether the amount of energy that converges is remotely enough to break a fault, and whether the observational record shows it happening. Let us take the record first, using this week's own events, and let us start with the earthquake this video is about. Port Olry, Espiritu Santo, sits at approximately 15 degrees south, 167 degrees east. Flip that through the centre of the Earth and the antipode is approximately 15 degrees north, 13 degrees west. That is West Africa. Specifically, it is the Western Sahel, in the border region between Senegal and Mali. Now consider what is there, geologically. That is stable continental craton, some of the oldest, coldest, most tectonically inert crust on the surface of this planet. There is no plate boundary, there is no subduction zone, there is no active fault system there capable of producing a large earthquake, and there is no historical record of one. So the antipodal theory, applied to Sunday's earthquake, predicts a large event in a place that does not have anything to break. It is not that the prediction is unlikely to come true, it is that there is no mechanism by which it could. Take the second case. The antipode of the northern Sumatra magnitude 6.9 falls in Colombia. And there was a large Colombian earthquake, a magnitude 7.4 in the Choco department. If you were looking to confirm the theory, that looks like a hit. It is not, for two separate and independently fatal reasons. The Colombian earthquake happened on the 10th of August. The Sumatra earthquake happened on the 15th. The supposed effect preceded its own cause by 5 days. And even setting the chronology aside, the Colombian epicenter was roughly 1,030 kilometers from the antipodal point. 1,000 kilometers is not a near miss. It is most of the width of a continent. Third case. On the 25th of March this year, a magnitude 7.5 struck near Tonga. Its antipode falls in the Sahara Desert. Nothing followed. Nothing was ever going to follow, for the same reason as the Sahel. There is nothing there to break, and this is not cherry-picking. Go through every earthquake of magnitude 7 or greater that this planet has produced in 2026. Compute the antipode of each one. Draw a circle 1,500 kilometers in radius around it, and look for any subsequent event of magnitude 6.0 or greater inside that circle. The answer, event by event, is none. Not a weak signal, not a marginal correlation, none. But here is the part I actually want you to take away, because it is more useful than any individual test. The theory, as it is usually stated, cannot be wrong. Ask the person making the claim what radius counts. Is it 100 kilometers, 500, 1,500, 3,000? Ask what time window counts. An hour, a week, 5 days in the wrong direction, 6 months? Ask what magnitude counts as a confirming event. A 7, a 6, a 4, a 2.5? None of those numbers are ever specified in advance. They are chosen afterwards, and they are chosen to fit. And once they are chosen afterwards, the theory becomes unfalsifiable, and an unfalsifiable claim is not a bold theory. It is not a theory at all. It is a description of whatever already happened, written in the future tense. Now put a number on how easy that is. This planet produces on the order of 3,500 earthquakes of magnitude 2 or greater every single day. Draw a circle 1,500 kilometers across anywhere on Earth that has any seismicity at all, wait a few days, and you will catch something. You could run the same exercise with the antipode of your own house and get a hit eventually. That is not evidence of a connection between your house and Indonesia. It is evidence that the Earth shakes constantly and circles that big cover a great deal of ground. While we are here, let me deal with 3 more, quickly, because they arrive in the same package. Solar activity triggering earthquakes. The idea is that flares, coronal mass ejections and geomagnetic storms destabilize faults, and this week ran the control experiment for us, at no charge, through the entire sequence, a magnitude 7.7, a magnitude 6.9, a magnitude 6.1, and hundreds of aftershocks. The sun was doing essentially nothing. It was producing B-class flares, the lowest category on the scale, rising only into the low C range. One sunspot region was growing and gaining a little magnetic complexity between its polarities, enough to put the forecast probability of an M-class flare somewhere in the 30 to 40% range and X-class at a nominal 5. There were no significant coronal hole streams pointed at us, no proton events, and no geomagnetic storming forecast. The sun was as quiet as it gets in a declining cycle, and the Earth had one of its loudest weekends of the year. The reverse test is available too. Solar maximum peaked in late 2024, and it was not accompanied by any global surge in large earthquakes. What the correlation actually is, when people find it, is a coin toss dressed up as a discovery. On any given day, there is a decent chance of both a notable solar event and a magnitude 6 somewhere on Earth. Pairing them up proves nothing at all, deliberate or induced triggering. Induced seismicity is real, and I want to be clear about that, because dismissing it entirely would be wrong. Wastewater injection has demonstrably produced damaging earthquakes in places that had almost none before. Reservoir impoundment behind large dams has done it. Geothermal operations have done it. But every documented case operates in the upper few kilometres of the crust, where fluid is being pushed into rock at pressure. Sunday's earthquake happened at 188 kilometres, under open ocean, in the interior of a descending slab, hundreds of kilometres from any human activity of any kind. There is no proposed mechanism, not one, that reaches that depth. And finally, the idea that the true numbers are being hidden. I want to grant the real part of this before I dismantle the rest, because there is a real part. Small earthquakes genuinely do appear on seismograph traces without ever entering a public catalogue. Station outages are routine. During this same window, multiple seismograph stations around Yellowstone were simply offline. Catalogue completeness varies enormously by region. A magnitude 2 in California is captured reliably, while a magnitude 4.5 in a remote ocean basin may not be. Anyone who has watched raw waveforms and then compared them to the published event list has seen this. It is legitimate. But look at what that observation actually is. It is undercounting at the bottom of the scale, in places with thin instrumentation. It is not concealment at the top. A magnitude 7 is recorded by hundreds of stations on every continent. It is located independently by the United States Geological Survey, by the European Mediterranean Seismological Centre, by Indonesia's BMKG, by Colombia's Geological Service, by Spain's National Institute, by Geofon, by national networks in a dozen countries with no obligation to agree with each other and frequently no interest in doing so. And they do not agree. That is the point. The Northern Sumatra earthquake was published as a magnitude 6.9 by one agency and a 6.4 by another, a difference of more than 5 times in energy, sitting in public, uncorrected for anyone to see. Spain's Institute and the European Centre routinely differ on Iberian events. Japan's agency and the American one use different magnitude scales, and publish different numbers as a matter of routine. A coordinated cover-up would produce agreement. What we actually observe is a permanent, visible, slightly embarrassing squabble between institutions that are not talking to each other. That is not what concealment looks like. It is what independence looks like. Part 14. So is something bigger coming? Let me answer the question in the title directly, and then let me tell you what I think you should actually do with the answer. Is the magnitude 6.1 that struck Espiritu Santo on the 16th of August a sign that something bigger is coming? No. It happened 188 kilometres below the seafloor, inside a descending slab of oceanic crust, separated from the shallow interface that produces great earthquakes by roughly 130 kilometres of hot rock. The static stress it delivered to that interface is beneath any threshold we can measure. The dynamic stresses carried by its waves were trivial, and the slab interior at that pressure is the least receptive environment for dynamic triggering that exists. It produced no tsunami, no damage, and a green alert. It was not caused by the Indonesian earthquakes, which were between 2,500 and 5,000 kilometres away, across a distance at which the physics of stress transfer has nothing left to say, and it did not push, prime, nudge, or destabilise anything above it. Is something bigger coming to Vanuatu? Yes, certainly, without any reference to last week whatsoever. 87 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater since 1900. One every 17 months sustained across 126 years. 34 events of magnitude 7.5 or greater in the same period. A boundary converging at up to 170 millimetres a year, 5 times the rate of the San Andreas, explicitly rated as capable of a magnitude 8 or above, with tsunami hazard reaching every coastline in the Pacific Ocean. 20 months ago, a magnitude 7.3 at 57 kilometres killed 14 people, injured 265, cut power and water across the capital, and affected 1 in 4 citizens of the country. Both of those answers are true simultaneously, and holding them at the same time is the whole skill. I think the reason people struggle with it is that the two answers feel like they should cancel each other out, and they do not. One of them is about a specific event and a specific mechanism. The other is about a place and a century of record. They are answers to different questions that happen to share a set of words, and there is a cost to getting it wrong in either direction. Read only the first answer, and you conclude that Vanuatu is fine, which it is not. It is one of the most exposed populations on Earth relative to its size and resources. Read only the second and you spend every week in a state of alarm, treating a boundary that produces routine large earthquakes as though each one were the opening of something, until the alarm stops meaning anything and you tune it out entirely. That second failure mode is, I think, the more dangerous of the two, and it is the one being manufactured at scale right now by accounts that have discovered that earthquakes generate attention. The earthquake that made the headlines is not the warning. The warning was issued 126 years ago in the form of a catalogue, and it has been reissued every 17 months since. So here is what to actually watch, and I want to leave you with something portable rather than something dramatic. Watch depth before magnitude. When the next large earthquake appears in your feed, find the depth before you find anything else. Under about 70 kilometres, pay attention. Over about 150, the shaking will be widely felt and the damage will usually be modest. That one habit will make you better calibrated than most of the accounts that will be shouting at you about it. Watch shallow, not deep. Along the New Hebrides Trench specifically, a cluster of magnitude 4 and 5 events in the upper 30 or 40 kilometres would be a meaningfully different signal from anything that has happened this month. That is where the megathrust is. That is the structure that makes the waves that cross oceans. Watch for aftershocks that should not exist. Intermediate depth earthquakes are aftershock poor, so the expectation after Sunday is near silence. Shallow aftershocks following a deep main shock would be a genuine anomaly worth taking seriously. Watch deformation, not counts. The satellite positioning stations across the arc measure strain accumulating in real time in millimetres. That is the loading. An earthquake count is the wreckage, and be extremely suspicious of anything that cannot be wrong. If a claim does not specify a distance, a time window, and a magnitude before the fact, it is not making a prediction. It is fitting a curve to yesterday. I want to add one more thing to that list, and it is the least exciting item and the most important one. Everything I have just described is a way of reading the news better. None of it changes what happens when the ground moves, and the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every conversation about earthquake forecasting is that the forecasting question is, in practical terms, close to irrelevant compared to the preparation question. Nobody predicted the December 2024 earthquake near Port Vila. Nobody could have. What determined whether people lived or died that afternoon was how the buildings around them had been built, whether the water system had redundancy, whether the roads out of the capital stayed open, and how quickly help could get in. That is not a satisfying thing to hear when you want to know what is coming. But it is where the actual leverage is. Vanuatu sits on a boundary that will keep delivering a magnitude 7 every year and a half whether anyone is watching the maps or not. The variable that is genuinely under human control is not when it arrives. It is what it finds when it gets there. And that reframing works for anywhere you happen to be. If you live somewhere with real seismic hazard, the west coast of North America, Japan, Chile, Indonesia, New Zealand, the Eastern Mediterranean, the question that matters is not whether this week's cluster means something. It is whether the building you are sitting in was designed for the shaking that place will eventually produce, and whether you have water and a plan for the days afterward. Those are boring questions. They also have answers, which is more than the forecasting question can offer. There is one thread from this weekend still hanging, and I will be honest that it is the one I find hardest to put down. On the island of Flores, in eastern Indonesia, the confirmed death toll from Friday's magnitude 7.7 stands at least 47. That figure came from the places that could be reached. Landslides closed the roads into Nagakeo, the region sitting closest to the epicenter, and cut communications with it, and more than a day after the ground stopped moving, no rescue team had physically arrived there, which means the number is not a measurement. It is a flaw. It is what could be counted from outside a door nobody had opened yet. When those roads clear, and they will clear, in a day or a week, that number is going to move, and whatever it lands on will be the real answer to the question this whole video has been circling, not whether the earthquakes were connected, not whether a chain was moving across the Pacific, just this: what 10 kilometres of depth does to a population that 188 kilometres does not. So the question I am left holding, and the one I would ask you to hold with me, is a simple one. How many people were behind that door?